Okay, so picture this. A world with almost 200 countries, right? Every single one with its own goals, its own culture, its own way of doing things. So what keeps the whole thing from just falling apart into total chaos? Well, the answer is this huge, mostly invisible set of rules that shapes everything from how we trade and travel to how we handle war and peace. We're talking about public international law, and you can think of it as the quiet, crucial operating system that our entire world runs on.
I mean, it's pretty easy to just take stuff like that for granted, right? But the only reason it works is because of international agreements. Think of the world as this massive, super complex game. International law is the rule book that all the players, the countries, have pretty much agreed to follow. It's what makes any kind of cooperation even possible. So let's dive in and see how that rule book gets made, who the players are, and of course, what happens when somebody breaks the rules.
So what is this stuff, really? The formal definition is that it's the set of rules and standards that nations recognize as binding. Sometimes you'll hear it called the law of nations. But honestly, the best way to think about it is just like we said. It's the world's operating system. It's the basic code that lets all these different countries interact in a way that's predictable and, orderly.
All right, to get our heads around this giant topic, we're going to break it down into 4 main parts. First up, we'll look at how these rules are actually created. Then we'll meet the key players who have to follow them. After that, we'll explore the playing field itself. We're talking land, sea, and even outer space. And finally, we'll get into what happens when the rules get broken.
Okay, part 1, crafting the global rulebook. So if international law is this big set of rules, where on earth do they come from? I mean, it's not like there's a world government or some global parliament writing laws for everyone. The way these rules get made is actually a lot different and frankly, way more interesting than you might think.
So the rules really come from 4 main places. First, you've got treaties. These are basically formal, written contracts between countries. Then there's custom, which is just fascinating. These are the unwritten rules that just pop up because states have been acting a certain way for so long that it's just accepted as law. And right there, you've got this amazing tension, this constant dance between the hard, written law of treaties and the powerful, unwritten force of custom. On top of that, you have general principles of law. These are basic ideas of fairness that you'd find in most legal systems. And finally, court decisions and expert writings that help everyone figure out what all the other rules mean.
Let's just zoom in on treaties for a second, because they're a huge part of all this. Making a treaty is like a multi-step dance. It all starts with negotiation, where all the countries get in a room and hammer out the details. Then you get consent, which is usually when they sign on the dotted line. But, and this is the key part, signing it isn't the final word. The last, binding step is usually something called ratification. That's when a country's own government officially says, yep, we're in, and makes that treaty part of its own law back on.
So we have the rule book. Now who's actually playing this game? Let's meet the players on the world stage. Who exactly are the main characters in this global drama?
The number 1 player by a long shot is the state, which is what we usually just call a country. But in international law, state has a very specific checklist. To be considered a state, you pretty much need 4 things. You need some defined territory, a permanent population living there, some form of government running the show, and the ability to actually have official relationships with other states.
So how does a new player get into the game? Well, you can't just declare yourself a state and call it a day. Other states have to recognize you. And this happens in 2 main flavors. De facto recognition is kind of like a trial run. It's other countries saying, okay, we see you're in control of this piece of land, so we'll deal with you for now. But de jure recognition, that's the real deal. It's permanent, it's legal, and it means you're fully welcomed into the club as a true sovereign equal.
And where do all these players hang out? The biggest stadium, for sure, is the United Nations. Its General Assembly is the closest thing our planet has to a global town hall. It's the one place where all 193 member states can get together, and every single one, from the biggest superpower to the tiniest island nation, gets 1 vote.
Now, besides states, you've got other really important institutions, like the International Criminal Court, or the ICC. And its job is totally unique. It goes after individuals, not countries, for the absolute worst crimes you can imagine. We're talking genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. It's really meant to be a court of last resort, stepping in only when a country's own courts can't or won't do the job.
All right, so we know the rules and we know the players. Now let's check out the playing field itself. This is where it gets really wild, as we look at the rules for land, sea, and even outer space. These rules basically define where one country's power ends and another's begins.
First things first, the most fundamental thing,
land. A state's territory is literally the ground it stands on. So how does a country legally get ownership of a chunk of the planet?
Well, international law has a few official methods. A country can acquire land through occupation, but only if that land doesn't already belong to someone else. There's cession, which is like a formal property sale, usually done with a treaty. You've got accretion, which is when Mother Nature helps out, like when a volcano makes a whole new island. And finally, there's prescription, which is basically a finders keepers rule for nations. If a state has peacefully controlled some land for a really, really long time and no one's kicked up a fuss, it can become theirs.
But a country's rights don't just end at the water's edge. The law of the sea is this massive, incredibly detailed part of the global rulebook. Once you get past a country's own coastal waters, you hit what's known as the high seas. And this massive area is considered a global commons. It belongs to nobody, so it's open to everybody. This means all countries have these basic freedoms, like sailing their ships, flying their planes over it, and even laying the internet cables that connect our entire digital world across the ocean floor. It's pretty amazing when you think about it.
So, we've gone from the depths of the ocean to the final frontier, outer space. As soon as humanity started pushing past the atmosphere in the last century, it became super obvious that we were going to need a completely new set of rules for this ultimate high ground.
I mean, just listen to this one line from the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. It just perfectly sums up the whole spirit of space law. It basically says that space, the moon, all of it, it's not up for grabs. No country can just plant a flag and claim it. It belongs to all of us, and it has to be explored peacefully for the good of all humankind. What a remarkable idea for our species, right?
And that brings us to our final and maybe the most important question of all. What happens when the rules get broken? I mean, a rulebook isn't much good if there aren't ways to settle arguments and deal with cheaters. So who are the referees, and what are the consequences?
The main referee for countries is the International Court of Justice, or the ICJ, also known as the World Court. Its whole job is to settle legal fights that states bring to it. Now, it's so important to remember the difference here. Unlike the ICC, which goes after people, the ICJ deals with arguments between states. One court for individuals who commit atrocities, this court for countries who are having a disagreement.
Now, sometimes breaking the rules involves people crossing borders. And this brings up two concepts that get mixed up all the time: extradition and asylum. So, what's the difference? Well, extradition is the formal process where one country agrees to send a person back to another country to stand trial for a crime. Asylum, on the other hand, is about protection. It's when a state gives shelter to someone who's fleeing persecution. So one is about criminal justice, the other is about humanitarian safety.
Let's play this out with a quick case study. Imagine someone is accused of a political crime in country A, and they manage to escape to country B. Country A is furious, right? And they demand that country B extradite this person immediately. What's country B supposed to do? Well, international law has this long-standing idea called the political offense exception. And the principle is pretty clear. Countries generally do not have to extradite people for purely political crimes, things like treason or sedition. So in our little scenario, country B is totally justified in saying no thanks to the extradition request. It's a perfect example of how even the rules about enforcing the rules have their own complex exceptions.
So there you have it, from treaties to territory, from the high seas to outer space. International law is this invisible web that helps our incredibly complicated world actually work. It's a system built by states, for states, and it's always, always evolving. But as we face all these new global challenges that don't care about borders, I'm talking about cyber warfare, climate change, it leaves us with one massive question. Is this global rulebook, built mostly in the 20th century, really ready for the next chapter?